The silence that fell over the battlefield was often more terrifying than the roar of artillery that preceded it. For the German officer corps, a caste steeped in the rigid traditions of Prussian militarism and the fanatical ideology of the Third Reich, that silence marked the end of the world as they knew it. It was the moment when the maps, the strategies, and the unyielding belief in ultimate victory crumbled into the stark, humiliating reality of surrender. These were men who had led the lightning-fast advances across Europe, whose uniforms commanded absolute obedience, and who had been indoctrinated to believe that death was preferable to capitulation. Yet, by the tens of thousands, and eventually by the millions, they found themselves handing over their sidearms, stripping off their medals, and walking with heads bowed into an uncertain future behind barbed wire. This is not just a story of defeat. It is a complex examination of how a proud and often arrogant elite adapted to a life where they were no longer the masters of Europe, but merely numbers in the logistical ledgers of their enemies. We are about to explore the hidden world of German officers in captivity, a world of secret privileges, psychological warfare, unexpected luxuries, and brutal deprivations. As we embark on this deep historical journey into the unknown lives of these prisoners, uncovering facts that have remained buried in archives for decades, please take a brief moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue producing these extensive, well-researched documentaries. If you want to see more history brought to life, click that subscribe button now so you won't miss what unfolds in the next chapters of this saga. To understand the experience of the German officer in captivity, one must first understand the psychological shock of the capture itself. For the average infantryman, surrender often brought a mix of fear and relief. Relief that the constant pounding of shelling had stopped, and that they might actually survive the war. But for the officer, particularly the career soldier or the fervent National Socialist, surrender was a catastrophic failure of duty. The first major shock to the system came at Stalingrad in early 1943. When Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the Sixth Army, it was a shattering blow to the Wehrmacht's morale. The images of high-ranking German generals wrapped in furs and blankets against the biting Russian cold, emerging from the cellars of the Univermag department store, signaled a turning point. Here, the treatment of officers began to diverge sharply depending on who captured them. In the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, the capture was chaotic and often lethal. German officers, terrified of Soviet retribution for the atrocities committed during the invasion, often stripped their rank insignia before surrendering, hoping to blend in with the enlisted men. They knew that the Commissar order and the brutal conduct of the war in the East had eroded any semblance of chivalry. However, the Soviet intelligence services, the NKVD, were meticulous in filtering the captives. They were looking for intelligence, for leverage, and for potential converts. The journey for these officers was a descent into hell, crammed into unheated cattle cars or forced to march hundreds of miles through the snow. The privileges of rank meant little when typhus and starvation set in. Yet, even in these desperate columns, the remnants of discipline remained. Senior officers would try to maintain order, insisting that their men march in formation, a futile attempt to hold on to dignity in the face of total ruin. Contrast this with the experience in the West, particularly after the Normandy landings in 1944 and the collapse of the Ruhr Pocket in 1945. Here, surrender often resembled a formalized military ceremony. Entire staffs would surrender intact. American and British forces were initially overwhelmed by the sheer volume of prisoners, but the Geneva Convention of 1929 provided a clear, legalistic framework for how these men were to be treated. This document was the shield behind which the German officer corps hid. Germany was a signatory, as were the United States and Great Britain, though the Soviet Union was not. Article 27 of the convention was the holy grail for the captured officer. It stated clearly that officers were to be treated with the regard due to their rank and age. Crucially, it stipulated that officer prisoners could not be compelled to work, unlike the enlisted men and non-commissioned officers who could be used for labor detachments. This distinction created an immediate and profound class divide within the prisoner of war population. Upon processing and collection points in France or Belgium, officers were rapidly segregated from their men. The rationale was twofold. For the Allies, separating the officers broke the chain of command, theoretically making the vast numbers of enlisted men easier to manage and less likely to organize resistance. For the German officers, this separation was often welcomed. It allowed them to preserve the illusion of superiority. They were moved to separate compounds, sometimes even separate camps entirely, known in American military parlance as officer camps. The journey to the permanent camps was a logistical operation of staggering proportions. For those destined for the United States, it meant a voyage across the Atlantic on Liberty ships. These vessels, which had brought supplies to the European theater, returned home filled with the enemy. For many German officers, this voyage was a revelation. Leaving behind the rubble of European cities and the starvation rations of the late war Wehrmacht, they were suddenly confronted with the industrial might of the United States. They saw the convoy lanes unclogged by submarines, the skies dominated by Allied aircraft, and, perhaps most shockingly, the food. The onboard mess halls served white bread, coffee, meat, and fresh fruit, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago. This gastronomic shock was a psychological weapon in itself. It demonstrated, more effectively than any propaganda leaflet, that Germany had lost the war of production and logistics long before the final bullet was fired. Upon arrival in the United States, the conditions for officers were frequently described as the Fritz Ritz. While this moniker was a sarcastic invention of the American press and public, who were rationing sugar and gasoline at home, there was truth to it. The United States government was scrupulous in its adherence to the Geneva Convention, partly out of a desire to maintain the moral high ground, but primarily to ensure reciprocal treatment for American officers held in Germany. German officers were transported to camps often located in rural areas, Texas, Mississippi, Kansas. They were housed in barracks that were heated in the winter. They were issued standard U.S. Army bedding, but the most significant privilege, the one that defined their daily existence, was the financial arrangement. Under the Geneva Convention, officers were entitled to pay. The detaining power was required to pay them a monthly salary equivalent to the pay of the corresponding rank in their own army. This wasn't paid in U.S. dollars that could be used for escape, but in canteen coupons or camp scrip. A German captain or major could earn enough scrip to buy toiletries, tobacco, beer, and even extra food at the camp canteen. While their men might be out in the fields harvesting cotton or peanuts, the officers remained in their compounds, organizing lectures, playing chess or tending to flower gardens. This idleness, however, was a double-edged sword. Without the distraction of labor, the officers were left to stew in their own defeat, analyzing the tactical errors of the war and reinforcing their own political and military hierarchies. Inside the wire, the Wehrmacht's structure was rigidly enforced by the prisoners themselves. The highest-ranking officer in the camp became the camp senior, or generic spokesman. He was the liaison with the American or British camp commandant. In these officer camps, the protocol was strict. Junior officers had to salute senior officers. They stood at attention when a general entered the room. The uniforms, though often worn and patched, were kept immaculately clean. In the early stages of the war, and certainly in the camps housing the Afrika Korps, the morale was unbroken. They believed the war was still winnable, or at least that a negotiated peace was inevitable. This belief system meant that the camp discipline was used to enforce Nazi ideology. Hardliners monitored their fellow officers for any signs of defeatism or cooperation with the enemy. The honor courts established secretly within the barracks could ostracize, threaten, or even arrange accidents for those who strayed from the party line. In Great Britain, the experience took a different, more cerebral turn. The British intelligence services, specifically MI-19, operated a series of special detention centres, the most famous being Trent Park in North London. This was not a camp in the traditional sense. It was a stately home, a golden cage reserved for captured generals and high-ranking staff officers. The treatment here was exceptionally good. They were given whiskey, newspapers, and respectful treatment by British officers who spoke fluent German. They were taken on walks in the countryside, but the walls had ears. Every room, every tree in the garden, and every fireplace was bugged. The British were not interested in interrogation by force. They were interested in the unguarded conversations between the generals themselves. In this relaxed atmosphere, the German generals, freed from the immediate stress of the front, began to talk. They argued about Hitler's competence. They blamed each other for the defeats, and they discussed war crimes. This surveillance revealed the deep fissures within the German officer corps, the tension between the aristocratic Prussian tradition and the new breed of Nazi politicized officers. It also provided the Allies with invaluable strategic insight and technical information about rocketry and submarines. The officers at Trent Park enjoyed the privileges of their rank: batmen to polish their boots, multi-course meals, while unknowingly providing the evidence that would later be used to understand the inner workings of the Nazi war machine. However, the situation was drastically different for those who fell into French hands towards the end of the war. France, devastated by occupation and burning with a desire for vengeance, was less inclined to follow the niceties of the Geneva Convention, although they were signatories. German officers in French custody often found themselves clearing minefields, a direct violation of international law, which prohibited using prisoners for dangerous work. The French argument was often that these were not acts of war, but reparations. The resentment was palpable. Officers who were used to being saluted were now spat upon by the civilian population if they were marched through towns. The honorable imprisonment that the Geneva Convention envisioned clashed violently with the emotional reality of a liberated, traumatized Europe. The concept of the Batman, or personal servant, is another crucial aspect of the officer's privilege in captivity. According to the regulations, Officers of a certain rank were entitled to have an orderly, an enlisted man assigned to them to perform menial tasks. In the large camps in the U.S. and UK, enlisted men were often drafted from the other compounds to serve in the officer quarters. These men cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and polished boots for the officers. It created a bizarre microcosm of the Third Reich surviving in the plains of Oklahoma or the moors of Yorkshire. The officers would pool their canteen coupons to pay these orderlies, or the orderlies would simply do it out of ingrained military habit and obedience. This reinforced the officers' sense of status. They were prisoners, yes, but they were still gentlemen who did not wash their own socks. But beneath the surface of this structured existence, a psychological rot was setting in. The officer's identity is tied to command. Without a unit to lead, without orders to execute, many fell into deep depression. This was known as barbed wire disease or camp psychosis. The symptoms were apathy, irritability, and a complete withdrawal from reality. To combat this, the senior officers organized the Lager University, or Camp University. In camps across the world, German officers, many of whom held doctorates or were experts in engineering, law, and history, began to teach classes. They created a curriculum that rivaled accredited universities. They taught languages, mathematics, physics, and business administration. This was not just a way to kill time. It was a desperate attempt to maintain intellectual superiority and prepare for the post-war world, whatever that might look like. Yet, the most intense struggle within the officer camps was political. The dichotomy between the old guard Prussians and the younger, fanatical Waffen-SS, or Nazified Wehrmacht officers, led to intense friction. In the early years of captivity, the Nazis dominated. They controlled the internal administration of the camps. They ensured that the daily news, often provided by American newspapers, was interpreted through a lens of skepticism or outright denial. When news of the Normandy landings arrived, the hardliners insisted it was a trap or a minor incursion that would be crushed. When news of the failed July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler reached the camps, the reaction was a violent split. The hardliners celebrated the Führer's survival and hunted down any officer who expressed sympathy for the plotters. There were documented cases where anti-Nazi officers had to be placed in protective custody by the American guards to save them from being beaten or killed by their fellow prisoners. As the war in Europe ground towards its inevitable conclusion in 1945, the privileges of the officers began to feel more precarious. The influx of prisoners became a flood. The carefully managed camps in the U.S. were at capacity, but in Europe, the situation was catastrophic. The Rheinwiesenlager, the meadow camps along the Rhine established by the Americans and French in the spring of 1945, stripped the officer of all dignity. Here, the sheer numbers overwhelmed any attempt at Geneva Convention standards. Officers and men alike were herded into open fields with no shelter, little food, and poor sanitation. Generals dug holes in the mud with their hands to sleep in. The hierarchy collapsed under the weight of survival. In these conditions, the rank on a shoulder board meant less than a piece of bread or a dry spot of ground. This was the Great Leveling, the moment when the officer class was finally forced to share the visceral suffering of the common soldier. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the officer experience was morphing into a tool for political reconstruction. The Soviets were less interested in the Geneva Convention and more interested in the Marxist dialectic. They separated the generals and the senior officers not just to give them better quarters, which were still Spartan compared to the West, but to subject them to intense re-education. The League of German Officers, Bund Deutscher Offiziere, was formed under Soviet supervision. Prominent generals like Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach were coerced or convinced to join, broadcasting anti-Hitler propaganda back to Germany. This was the ultimate betrayal in the eyes of the hardliners. An officer's duty was to remain silent, yet here were generals calling for the overthrow of the government. The mental strain on the officers in Soviet captivity was immense. They were caught between their oath of loyalty, the disastrous reality of the war, and the pressure from their captors to denounce the regime they had served. As we analyze the initial phase of captivity, we see a picture of a fractured elite. The German officer corps entered captivity with their hierarchy intact, clutching their copy of the Geneva Convention like a shield. In the West, they found a captor who respected the rules, allowing them to recreate a shadow of their former lives, complete with salutes, orderlies, and study groups. In the East, they found a captor who viewed them as war criminals and political pawns. But in all cases, the privilege of the officer was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by the boredom of confinement, the political infighting among themselves, and the dawning realization of the total devastation of their homeland. The camps became pressure cookers. In the U.S., officers used their canteen funds to buy materials to build elaborate theater stages, putting on plays and concerts. They brewed illegal alcohol from dried fruit and potatoes. They forged paperwork and built tunnels, not always to escape back to a Germany that was collapsing, but to assert their agency, to prove they were still active soldiers. Escape from a camp in Tennessee or Mississippi was logically futile. Where would they go? The Atlantic Ocean was an impassable barrier. Yet, the duty to escape was ingrained in the officers' code. They made compasses out of magnetized razor blades and maps out of stolen paper, engaging in a battle of wits with their American guards. But the true test of the officer's character in captivity was not how they treated their guards, but how they treated the truth. As the Allied armies overran the concentration camps in 1945, films and photographs of the Holocaust were brought into the POW camps. The reaction of the officers to this exposure is a critical part of our story. Some reacted with genuine horror and shame, claiming ignorance. Others dismissed it as Allied propaganda, a fake production by Hollywood. This denial was a psychological defense mechanism. To admit the truth of the genocide was to admit that their service, their sacrifice, and their entire professional lives had been in service of a criminal enterprise. The privileges they clung to, the separate mess halls, the polished boots, the respect for rank, were desperate attempts to maintain the facade of the honorable Wehrmacht in the face of undeniable moral bankruptcy. As the sun set on the Third Reich in May 1945, the German officers in captivity faced a new reality. They were no longer prisoners of war of a belligerent nation. They were the detained remnants of a defunct state. The legal frameworks began to shift. The privileges would eventually be stripped away, and the long, hard road to repatriation would begin. But before we get to the end of the story, we must look closer at the daily life inside the golden cage and the red hell. How did a German general spend his Tuesday in a camp in Mississippi versus a camp in Siberia? What were the intricate economies they built? How did they discipline their own men when the guards weren't looking? We have only scratched the surface of this hidden history. The world of the POW camp was a universe unto itself, with its own laws, its own currency, and its own tragedies. As we prepare to delve into the gritty details of daily survival, interrogation, and the slow erosion of the Nazi ideal in Part 2, make sure you are subscribed. You do not want to miss the detailed account of how these men lived, how they fought each other, and how they were eventually forced to confront the consequences of the war they led. While the artillery barrages had ceased for the captured German officer, the war was far from over. It merely changed its form. It shifted from a war of ballistics and maneuvers to a war of ideology, psychology, and internal terror. Inside the prisoner of war camps, particularly those in the United States and Great Britain, a strange and often brutal microcosm of the Third Reich persisted, sometimes stronger and more fanatical than in Germany itself. The barbed wire fences kept the enemy out, but they also locked the prisoners in with their own demons and their own ruthless hierarchy. To understand the officers' experience, one must look past the physical conditions of the barracks and into the shadowy political battles that raged when the guards were not looking. This was the war behind the wire, a struggle for the soul of the defeated army. As we continue to uncover the secrets of these camps, delving into the honor courts and the psychological games played by intelligence agencies, please ensure you are subscribed to our channel. We are documenting history in a way few others do, and your subscription helps us keep these stories alive. In the comfortable officer camps of the United States, amidst the relative luxury of ample food and clean sheets, a reign of terror often existed. For the first few years of American involvement, the U.S. military adopted a policy of indirect rule. They allowed the German officers to manage their own internal affairs, believing that the German discipline would keep the camps orderly and efficient. This was a miscalculation. It allowed the hardline Nazi officers to seize total control. In camps like Camp Concordia in Kansas or Camp Papago Park in Arizona, the senior German officers established a covert Gestapo. They monitored the mail, the conversations, and the attitudes of their fellow prisoners. Any officer who expressed doubt about the final victory, or who spoke critically of Hitler, was labeled a traitor. This was not a matter of mere social ostracization. It was a matter of life and death. The Holy Ghost, or Fame tribunals, were secret courts established within the barracks. Late at night, when the American guards were patrolling the perimeter, a court of senior Nazi officers would convene. The accused would be dragged from his bunk and put on trial for defeatism or collaboration. The sentences ranged from severe beatings to forced suicide. The honor suicide was a particularly chilling phenomenon. The accused would be given a rope or a razor blade and told that for the sake of his family's honor back in Germany, he must take his own life. If he refused, the threat extended to his wife and children back home, or he would be beaten to death and the scene staged to look like an accident. American authorities were often baffled by the string of suicides in these camps, only realizing too late that they were effectively sanctioning a Nazi enclave on American soil. The fanaticism was fueled by the information isolation. In many officer camps, the designated news officer would translate American newspapers for the group. However, they would twist the translation to fit the Nazi narrative. A report on a heavy Allied bombing raid on Berlin would be translated as a terror attack that was repelled with heavy losses to the enemy. The D-Day landings were dismissed for weeks as a minor diversion. This bubble of delusion was maintained by the officers to preserve their own sanity and status. To admit that the news was true was to admit that their world was ending. However, not all was darkness and terror. To combat the crushing boredom, the officers' greatest enemy, the prisoners constructed an elaborate cultural life. The Lager Universitäten, or camp universities, became centers of genuine academic excellence. In a large officer camp, one could find experts in almost every field: architects, chemists, classical philologists, and economists. They formalized a curriculum, issued diplomas, and held exams. It was a surreal sight. Rows of men in Wehrmacht uniforms sitting on wooden benches in a barrack in Mississippi, taking copious notes on advanced calculus or the history of the Hanseatic League. This was a psychological defense mechanism. By engaging in high intellectual pursuits, the officers reinforced their self-image as the cultural elite of Europe, distinct from the uncultured Americans who guarded them. Theater and music also played a massive role. The officers pooled their money to buy instruments and costumes. They staged elaborate productions of Shakespeare, Goethe, and Schiller. The female roles were played by young lieutenants, often with surprisingly professional costumes tailored from scraps of fabric and dyed with beet juice or coffee. These performances were not just hobbies. They were fiercely competitive and attended with the same formality as a night at the Berlin Opera. Senior generals would sit in the front row, critical and attentive. For a few hours, the harsh reality of captivity faded, replaced by the comfort of German culture. While the Americans struggled with the internal politics of the camps, the British took a different, more sophisticated approach to their high-ranking captives. At Trent Park and other special listening sites, the British Secret Intelligence Service turned the officers' comfort into a weapon. The generals held there were treated like royalty. They were given allowances to buy expensive clothes, they had access to a well-stocked wine cellar, and they were taken on excursions to London to see the bomb damage, or the lack thereof. The goal was to loosen their tongues. The British secret listeners, often German Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazis, sat in the basement with headphones, transcribing every word spoken in the drawing rooms above. The conversations they recorded were damning. Freed from the need to maintain morale in front of their subordinates, the generals spoke with shocking candor. They discussed the technical details of the V-2 rockets, the effectiveness of Allied radar, and the strategic blunders of the High Command. But most disturbingly, they discussed the atrocities. Transcripts from Trent Park revealed generals casually discussing the mass shootings of Jews and partisans on the Eastern Front. General Dietrich von Koltitz, the last commander of Paris, was recorded admitting that he had executed Jews. Others bragged about the efficiency of the SS Einsatzgruppen. These recordings destroyed the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular army fought an honorable war while only the SS committed crimes. The British listeners heard firsthand that the army leadership was fully aware of and often complicit in the genocide. This intelligence was not used to prosecute them immediately, but was gathered to build a comprehensive picture of the enemy's psyche and to prepare for the post-war trials. In stark contrast to the psychological games of the West, The experience of the German officer in the Soviet Union was a physical and existential struggle for survival. There were no golden cages in the Gulag system. While general officers were eventually separated and given slightly better rations than the enlisted men, better was a relative term. In the camps of the USSR, hunger was the constant companion. The daily ration often consisted of a watery soup and a few 100 grams of dark, wet bread. The Soviet approach to the German officer corps was rooted in Marxist ideology. They viewed the officers not just as military enemies, but as class enemies, the bourgeois enforcers of fascism. Therefore, the Captivity was designed to break them and remold them. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, employed a mix of brutality and indoctrination. Officers were subjected to endless interrogations, often lasting for days without sleep. They were pressured to sign confessions admitting to war crimes, whether they had committed them or not. But the Soviets also offered a way out: political conversion. Antifa, anti-fascist schools, were established within the camps. Officers were lectured on the virtues of communism and the evils of Hitlerism. This created a profound schism in the ranks of the prisoners in the East. Those who joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, NKFD, and the League of German Officers, BDO, were branded as traitors by their comrades. Led by General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had surrendered at Stalingrad, these officers broadcast radio messages back to the German lines, urging soldiers to surrender and overthrow Hitler. For the traditional Prussian officer, this was the ultimate heresy. Loyalty to the oath was paramount. Yet, as the war dragged on and the defeat became obvious, more and more officers in Soviet captivity began to turn. Some did it out of genuine disillusionment with Hitler, recognizing that he was destroying Germany. Others did it purely for survival, hoping that cooperation would lead to better food and an earlier ticket home. The psychological pressure in the Soviet camps was intense. An officer had to choose between becoming a pariah among his peers or starving in silence. The Soviets skillfully exploited these divisions, using the converted officers to interrogate and pressure the holdouts. Back in the United States, the turning point for the officer POWs came in the spring of 1945. As the Allied armies overran Germany, they liberated the concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The horrors they found were filmed and photographed. The U.S. government decided that the German prisoners, insulated in their camps across the ocean, needed to see what their nation had done. The atrocity films became mandatory viewing. In camp theaters across America, the lights went down, and the footage of piles of emaciated bodies, gas chambers, and mass graves flickered on the screen. The reaction of the German officers was a complex study in human psychology. American guards reported a wide range of responses. Some officers wept openly, burying their heads in their hands. Others watched in stony silence. But a significant number reacted with aggressive denial. They claimed the films were fakes, staged by Hollywood using mannequins or starving actors. They argued that Germans could not do such things. This denial was not just stubbornness, it was a desperate attempt to preserve their identity. If they admitted these crimes were real, they had to admit that their entire service, their sacrifices, and their leadership had been in the service of absolute evil. It was a psychological break that many could not make. They retreated further into their internal hierarchies, blaming the SS, blaming the Allies, blaming anyone but themselves. However, for the younger generation of officers, those who were not yet fully hardened, these films planted the seeds of a deep, agonizing shame that would define their post-war lives. As the Third Reich formally surrendered in May 1945, the legal status of the prisoners changed overnight. They were no longer prisoners of war protected by a neutral power. They were disarmed enemy forces. In the U.S., the generous canteen system began to dry up. The rations were cut. The Fritz Ritz was closed. The American public, now seeing the images of the Holocaust, had no patience for pampering German officers. The mood in the camps shifted from a waiting game to anxiety. What would happen to them? Would they be handed over to the Russians? Would they be put on trial? The re-education program launched by the Americans was an attempt to instill democratic values in the prisoners before they returned to rebuild Germany. This program was met with mixed results among the officers. The haughty arrogance of the Prussian caste made them resistant to being taught by Americans they considered culturally inferior. They viewed the democracy classes with cynicism. However, a secretive group of intellectual prisoners, often those who had been anti-Nazi all along, began to cooperate with the authorities to produce a newspaper called Der Ruf, the Call. This paper, written by prisoners for prisoners, began to facilitate a genuine debate about the future of Germany. It was the beginning of the intellectual foundation of the future Federal Republic of Germany, forged in the barracks of prisoner camps. But while the Americans were trying to teach democracy with books and lectures, the French were teaching reality with labor. When the U.S. transferred hundreds of thousands of prisoners to French custody in 1945 and 1946 to help with Reconstruction, the officers found themselves in a precarious position. The French, bitter from occupation, had little respect for the officers' exemption from labor. While they couldn't officially force officers to work in mines, they made the alternative, sitting in freezing, unheated tents with starvation rations so unbearable that many officers volunteered to work in the fields just to get food. The sight of a German major digging potatoes in a French field was a powerful symbol of the total collapse of the Wehrmacht's prestige. It was here, in the mud of the country they had once conquered, that the arrogance was finally beaten out of them. They were stripped of their batmen, their shiny boots were ruined, and they were subjected to the anger of the French civilians. It was a harsh, but perhaps necessary, lesson in humility. There is a specific, often overlooked aspect of the officer's experience: the relationship with the guards. In the U.S., a strange dynamic often developed. The American guards, often older men or those unfit for combat duty, sometimes developed amicable relationships with the prisoners. They would trade cigarettes for handmade crafts, intricate ships inside bottles, or oil paintings made by talented officer artists. These artifacts still sit in attics across America today, relics of a strange friendship between captor and captive. But this fraternization was strictly forbidden and had to be hidden. In the Soviet Union, the relationship was purely transactional or antagonistic. The guard was the absolute master, and the officer was the slave. A Soviet guard could shoot a prisoner for stepping out of line with little consequence. The fear of the Ivans was so deep ingrained in the German psyche that officers in American camps would turn pale at the mere rumor of being transferred to Russian custody. One of the most fascinating untold stories is the economic system of the officer camps. Cigarettes were the gold standard. With cigarettes, an officer could buy extra food, pay for laundry services, or bribe guards. But inside the officer compounds, a service economy flourished. Officers who were lawyers in civilian life offered legal advice for the post-war trials. Architects drew up plans for houses that officers hoped to build when they returned home. This shadow economy kept their minds active and maintained a semblance of civil society. It proved that you could strip the uniform off the man, but you couldn't strip the profession or the class structure. As 1946 rolled around, the repatriation process began, but it was agonizingly slow. The officers were often the last to be released. The Allies felt that the officers were the carriers of the virus of Nazism and needed to be held longer to ensure they were fully denazified. This indefinite detention led to a new wave of barbed wire disease. The uncertainty was torture. Men who had commanded thousands now sat staring at the fence, tracking the migration of birds, desperate for any sign that they would be allowed to go home. The golden cage had tarnished. The theater productions stopped. The university classes dwindled as apathy set in. The political infighting cooled down because everyone was united in a single desire: freedom. But the Germany they were returning to was not the one they left. It was a ruin, divided into zones, its cities flattened, its reputation destroyed. The German officer was returning not as a hero, but as a scapegoat. In the next and final part of our series, we will explore the return. We will follow these men as they board the trains back to a devastated Germany. We will look at the Nuremberg trials and how the officer corps tried to defend itself. We will examine the fates of the men who spent a decade in Soviet Gulags, only returning in 1955. And we will ask the ultimate question: did they ever truly understand their role in the catastrophe? The story of the German POW is a story of the ascent to hubris and the descent into humility. It is a lesson in how quickly the mighty can fall and how the human spirit adapts to the loss of freedom. Do not miss the conclusion of this epic saga. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you are notified immediately when Part 3 is released. The trains moved slowly, often halting for hours on tracks that had been hastily repaired after years of bombardment. For the men inside, huddled in cattle cars or sitting on hard wooden benches, the pace was agonizing. They were returning to a homeland that many of them would not recognize. The arrogance of 1939 and the desperate fanaticism of 1945 had evaporated, replaced by a hollow anxiety. What waited for them at the end of the line? For the German officer, the return home was not a hero's welcome. There were no parades, no brass bands, and no flowers thrown by adoring crowds. Instead, there was the gray reality of a defeated, occupied, and divided nation. They were returning not as conquerors, but as the living reminders of a catastrophe that the world and their own countrymen wanted desperately to forget. This is the story of the aftermath, the grueling process of denazification, the decade-long nightmare in the Soviet Gulags, and the silent struggle of a proud caste trying to find a place in a democracy they had once despised. As we reach the conclusion of this epic trilogy, seeing the full arc from the height of military power to the depths of the Gulag, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. These stories of survival and history's turning points are crucial to understanding our world today. Click subscribe now so you don't miss our future documentaries. The repatriation from the West began in earnest in 1946 and continued through 1948. For the officers held in the United States and Great Britain, the physical journey was comfortable enough, but the psychological transition was jarring. Before they could even step foot in their hometowns, they had to pass through the bureaucratic purgatory of denazification. The Allies were determined to purge German society of National Socialist influence. Every officer had to fill out the infamous Fragebogen, a questionnaire with over 130 detailed questions about their past, their political affiliations, their promotions, and their beliefs. For the career officer, this form was a minefield. If they admitted to early membership in the Nazi Party or receiving certain honors, they faced arrest, a ban on employment, or the confiscation of their property. This led to the widespread phenomenon of the Persilschein, a slang term derived from a popular laundry detergent. It referred to a whitewashed character reference. Officers scrambled to find Jewish neighbors they had once helped, or anti-Nazi clergymen who could vouch for their clean character. It was a humiliating scramble for survival, where a general might beg a former subordinate for a letter proving he wasn't a fanatic. The camaraderie of the front lines dissolved as men fought to save their own skins in the face of Allied tribunals. When they were finally released into the civilian population, the shock was absolute. Officers who had been captured in North Africa in 1943 remembered a Germany of intact cities and high morale. They returned to moonscapes. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were piles of rubble. The landmarks of their youth were gone. But more painful than the physical destruction was the social displacement. The German officer corps had been a privileged caste. They were men of status and authority. Now, in the ruins of 1947, their rank meant nothing. In fact, it was a liability. The Allied occupation authorities banned former senior officers from many professions. They could not be teachers, lawyers, or government officials. Thus, a generation of men trained to command divisions found themselves doing menial labor. It was not uncommon to see a former colonel clearing bricks from the streets, or a major working as a farmhand in exchange for potatoes. This status anxiety was crushing. They had to answer to Allied military police, often young men in their 20s, who treated these Prussian veterans with contempt. The humiliation was compounded by the domestic situation. Many officers returned to find their wives had become the heads of the household, having survived the bombing and the occupation on their own. The patriarchal authority of the German father was shattered. They were strangers in their own homes, ghosts who sat silently at the dinner table, unable to relate to the struggles their families had endured while they were playing soccer in a camp in Mississippi. However, while the officers from the West struggled with unemployment and bruised egos, their comrades in the East were fighting for their lives. The story of the German POWs in the Soviet Union is a tragedy distinct from all others. Stalin had no intention of releasing the Hitlerite bandits quickly. While the sick and the rank-and-file soldiers began to trickle back in the late 1940s, the officers, especially the specialists, the SS and the generals, were held as leverage and as slave labor. In 1949 and 1950, a wave of terror swept through the Soviet camps. The Soviet authorities, wishing to legalize the continued detention of these men, staged mass show trials, Officers were abruptly charged with vague war crimes. A battalion commander might be charged for the destruction of a bridge during a retreat, an act of war universally recognized as legal, but in the Soviet court it was sabotage against the proletariat. The trials were farces. There were no defense attorneys, and the verdicts were often pre-written. The sentence was almost always the same: 25 years of hard labor. Overnight, their status changed. They were no longer prisoners of war protected by international law. They were war convicts, Kriegsverurteilte. They were stripped of their Wehrmacht uniforms and forced to wear the garb of the common criminal. They were sent to the furthest reaches of the Gulag archipelago, to Vorkuta in the frozen Arctic, to the uranium mines, and to the lead mines of Siberia. The conditions were medieval. Men worked in temperatures of -40 degrees, digging coal or ore with primitive tools. The death rate was staggering. Yet, even in the Gulag, the German officers' discipline resurfaced in unexpected ways. In camps like Vorkuta, the German prisoners formed a distinct, organized bloc. They were known for their hygiene. Even in filth, they tried to shave and wash. Their solidarity and their refusal to cooperate with the criminal gangs that ran the camps. In 1953, following the death of Stalin, a massive strike wave hit the Gulag system. In Vorkuta, German officers played a key role in organizing the resistance. They used their military training to set up perimeter security for the striking prisoners and to negotiate with the camp commandants. It was a final, desperate act of defiance. Nazi officers and Russian political dissidents standing together against the Soviet state. Back in West Germany, the economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, was beginning. The rubble was being cleared, the factories were humming, and a new democratic state was rising. But a shadow hung over this new prosperity. The missing men in the East. The plight of the POWs in Russia was a burning political issue. Every Sunday, church services included prayers for the Heimkehrer, homecomers. Families set extra plates at the table for Christmas, waiting for men who had been gone for a decade. The breakthrough came in September 1955. The West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, traveled to Moscow. It was a historic and tense summit. The Soviets initially refused to discuss the prisoners, claiming only war criminals remained. Adenauer, a shrewd politician, played a dangerous game. He agreed to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, a huge concession, in exchange for the release of the final 10,000 prisoners. The deal was struck. The return of the last 10,000 in late 1955 and early 1956 is one of the most emotional moments in modern German history. The trains arrived at the Friedland transit camp near the East German border. These men were the hardcore survivors, generals, SS officers, and the unlucky ones who had simply been caught in the bureaucratic web. They looked like ghosts. They were gaunt, their faces weathered by the Siberian wind, wearing quilted Soviet jackets or ragged Wehrmacht greatcoats that they had preserved for 10 years for this specific moment. The scenes at Friedland were heart-wrenching. Mothers held up photos of sons who had gone missing in 1943, asking the returning men, "Did you see him? Do you know Hans?" Wives who had waited 10 years ran to embrace husbands they barely recognized. But for many, there was no one waiting. Some wives had remarried, assuming their husbands were dead. Some parents had died of old age. The late returnees, Spätheimkehrer, stepped off the train into a Germany that was alien to them. They saw neon lights, Volkswagen Beetles, and American rock and roll. They had missed the entire Reconstruction. They were men of the 1930s stepping into the late 1950s. They were out of time. The integration of these late returnees was difficult. The West German government gave them generous financial compensation and priority for jobs, treating them as victims of Stalinism rather than perpetrators of Hitlerism. This created a moral ambiguity that still haunts Germany. The focus was on their suffering in the Gulag, which conveniently allowed society to ignore what these men had done before they were captured. The narrative of the victim German became a way to avoid the narrative of the perpetrator German. This silence was the defining characteristic of the post-war officer class. They formed veteran associations, like the HIAG for the Waffen-SS, or the Verband Deutscher Soldaten. In these closed circles, they drank beer and reminisced about the comradeship of the front. They created a sanitized version of history where the Wehrmacht was a noble army that fought honorably to save Europe from Bolshevism, claiming they knew nothing of the Holocaust. This myth of the clean Wehrmacht was accepted by the Western Allies because, by the 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing. The Americans needed the German military expertise. This led to the most surreal twist in the officer's journey. The creation of the Bundeswehr in 1955. Only 10 years after the unconditional surrender, West Germany was allowed to rearm. Who would lead this new army? It had to be the old officers. There was no one else. A rigorous screening process was set up to weed out the fanatical Nazis, but the vast majority of the new generals were men who had served Hitler. The Himmerod Memorandum, a secret document written by former Wehrmacht experts, laid the groundwork for this. It demanded the rehabilitation of the German soldiers' honor as a prerequisite for rearmament. The Allies agreed. So, the men who had marched into Poland and France, who had surrendered at Stalingrad, and sweated in the camps of Mississippi and Siberia, put on uniforms once again. But this time, the uniforms were different. The boots were different. And the oath was to a democratic constitution. It was a strange redemption. General Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most brilliant strategist and a convicted war criminal who served time in British prison, became an unofficial advisor to the new army. The continuity was undeniable. But what of the internal life of these men? The mute fathers became a cultural trope in Germany. In the evenings, the former officers would sit in their armchairs, smoking cigarettes, staring into space. They rarely spoke of the war to their children. When their children, the generation of 1968, began to ask, "Father, what did you do in the war?" the answer was often silence or a defensive explosion of anger. The trauma of captivity, the shame of defeat, and the guilt, acknowledged or repressed, of the atrocities created a psychological wall. They had survived the barbed wire, but they never truly escaped the cage of their memories. The legacy of the German officer POW is complex. In the military academies of the US and UK today, their campaigns are still studied. Their tactical brilliance is admired, but the human story serves as a grim warning. These were men who bound themselves to a criminal regime through an oath of obedience. They enjoyed the privileges of their caste, the batmen, the wine, the respect, right up until the moment the trap snapped shut. Their experience in captivity revealed the fragility of their code of honor. In the luxury of the American camps, some maintained their dignity, while others turned into fanatical bullies. In the horror of the Soviet camps, some broke, while others found a strength they didn't know they had. Ultimately, the story of the German officer in captivity is the story of a complete dismantling of a worldview. They went in as masters of the world and came out as broken men, forced to build a new life in the shadow of the ruins they had helped create. From the Fritz Ritz in Texas to the coal mines of Vorkuta, the journey of these men mirrors the catastrophic trajectory of Germany in the 20th century. It is a lesson in the price of hubris and the long, painful road to redemption. Thank you for joining us on this extensive three-part journey through one of history's most overlooked chapters. The story of the German POWs is vast, and we've only just scratched the surface. If you found this deep dive valuable, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. Your support allows us to keep the past alive. Leave a comment below. What historical topic should we cover in our next documentary series? Until then, thank you for watching.